This morning we're looking at Psalm 55, and I'm representing it because my voice was a bit in and out when I did it with the larger group this morning, and I wanted for clarity to have a clear recording. Psalm 55, I even this morning retitled it, as we'll get to see in the text with verse 7, Who will give me a wing like a dove? What's distinctive about this psalm is that, attributed to King David is addressing a foe who was an intimate, feeling betrayed by somebody he felt very close to. We don't see psalm itself the name of that former friend, but the classic commentaries, Rashi of the 11th century, Radak, Spain 13th century, attribute it to Achitophel, who was an advisor to David and then later to his son Absalom. Absalom rebelled against the king, King David. Yesterday, with Psalm 54, the context was a young David hiding from King Saul. Now it's the second book of Samuel, contrast to yesterday, the first book of Samuel, toward the end of David's life. Physically, he not the former leader fighter, and his son will rebel. Second book of Samuel, chapter 15. Let me give a little bit of the reading of context. Absalom, verse 12, also sent to fetch Achitophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, Yoetz David, from the town of Gilo. Gilo is today on the part of Jerusalem, the edge of Jerusalem that faces Bethlehem, Beit Lechem. And so this is the first appearance of the name Achitophel, and here called Yoetz David, David's advisor. The medieval commentators, Rashi, Radak, they will say of Achitophel that he was a great scholar of Torah and that he was both David's teacher, but more David's study partner. It's kind of a smile evoking to see them as deep scholars of Torah, imagining David likewise as a student and learner with Achitophel of Torah. Verse 13, someone came and told David, the loyalty of the men of Israel has veered toward Absalom. ... And now David says, let us flee at once, or none of us will escape from Absalom. A bitter moment in David's life when his own son becomes his foe, seeking to take over the throne. Verse 30. David, meanwhile, went up the slope of the Mount of Olives, weeping. As he went, his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. 31. David, please, O Lord, frustrate Achitophel's counsel. And the rabbis, the classic commentators, David, Radak, Rashi, and Radak, will say that this psalm was written in this time of fleeing from Absalom. Verse 20 of the next chapter, chapter 16. Absalom then said to Achitophel, what do you advise us to do? And Achitophel said to Absalom, verse 21, have intercourse with your father's concubines, whom he left to mind the palace. And when all Israel hears that you have dared the wrath of your father, All who support you will be encouraged. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom lay with his father's concubines, with the full knowledge of all of Israel. In those days, the advice which Ahithophel gave was accepted like an oracle sought from God. That is how all the advice of Ahithophel was esteemed, both by David and by Absalom. And so in this case, Ahithophel's advice is followed. It's the ultimate betrayal of his father, the assertion by Absalom that he has no fear of his father, that no less than his father's concubines, his father's bed and his women are his own. Chapter 17, verse 1. And Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Let me pick 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I will come upon him when he is weary." The advice, verse 4, Absalom and all the elders of Israel. But Absalom said, "Summon Hushai the Archite as well, so we can hear what he too has to say." Hushai came to Absalom, and Absalom said to him, "This is what Ahithophel has advised. Shall we follow his advice? If not, what do you say?" And so Absalom seeks a second opinion. Hushai said to Absalom, "This time the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good. You know," Hushai continued, "that your father and his men are courageous fighters." Except in this case, verse 15, Hushai gives notice to the priests, Sadok and Avitar, as to what Absalom had been advised by Ahithophel, and then that message is conveyed to David, who flees. Because Absalom had disregarded Ahithophel's advice and taken Hushai's advice, David gets away. Verse 23, when Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and went home to his native town. He set his affairs in order, and then he hanged himself. He was buried in his ancestral tomb. It's not the only suicide in the Bible, but it's one of only a handful. Ahithophel was David's Yoetz, his advisor, who turned on him and saw that David survived. And so that's context. Context for this psalm. And with that, I will post the psalm, Psalm 55, and look to read it now to you. Who will give me a wing like a dove? For the conductor of string music, a maskil of David. Give ear, God, to my prayer, and do not hide yourself from my plea. Attend to me and answer me. I am distraught in my complaint and moan at the voice of the enemy because of the oppression of the wicked, for they bring mischief upon me and in fury persecute me. My heart writhes within me, and terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. And I say, who will give me a wing like a dove? I would fly away and be at rest. Behold, I would wander far. I would lodge in the wilderness. Selah. I would make haste to a shelter for me from the stormy tempest wind. Destroy my supreme, divide their tongue, for I have seen violence and strife In the city, day and night they make rounds on her walls. Envy and mischief are in the midst of her. Ruin is in her midst. Fraud and deceit never depart from her broad place. For it was not an enemy that taunted me. I could have borne that. Nor was it my adversary that acted grandiosely against me. I could have hidden from him. But you, a man my equal, my teacher, and my intimate friend, with whom together we shared sweet secrets in the house of God, we walked with elation. May it come upon them. May they descend to Sheol alive, for evil is in dwellings in their core. As for me, I call upon God, and Adonai saves me. Evening and morning and noon, I complain and moan, and God hears my voice. God redeemed my soul in peace, so that none would come near me, for many stood against me. May El hear and humble them, who is enthroned of old. Selah. For they never change, and they have no fear of God. God sent forth divine hands against him who was at peace, who had desecrated God's covenant. Smoother than butter was his mouth, but battle was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. God send forth your burden upon Adonai, and God will sustain you. God will never let the righteous stumble. You cause them to descend to the pit of Shachad. People of bloodshed and deceit will not live out half their lives. But as for me, I will trust in you. The psalm is written quite artfully in terms of its alliterations, its rhythms, and back and forth with images. Let me give you some tastes of that artistry. Listen to the sound of verse 2 and the beginning of verse 3. Know that chirik is the vowel, that's the E sound, a dot and a yud, which means my. As the psalm begins, the psalter begins pleading with my prayer, my plea, attend to me, answer me. In Hebrew, Ha'ina Elohim tefilati, ve'al titalem mitchinati, hakshiva li v'nei. It's a rhythm and a sound, but there's also a repetition of ideas that appear and then reappear. For instance, verse 15, with whom together we shared sweet secrets. In the house of God we walked with elation. It is echoed in verse 21. God sent forth divine hands against him. Bish Lomav, who was at peace, a description of earlier returning, as if it's churning, that this enemy was a loyal friend, one with whom there was peace. Or the next verse, 16, may them upon them, now in plural, may they descend to Sheol alive. Echoed in verse 24, but for you, God, cause them to descend to the pit of Shachad, people of bloodshed and deceit. Sheol and Shachad are different names for the grave or for the afterlife. In the sense of the individual being part of a larger group. So there's a shift from the he to the them, but the core, the center of this psalm is the sense of the betrayal of a friend. Here too, look at how time gets repeated. Verse 11, day and night they make rounds on her walls, the walls of Jerusalem. And then verse 18, evening and morning and noon I complain and moan. The sense of time and the repeat of feeling consumed with the moaning and complaining of this betrayal at all times of the day. The word moan that I translate as moan, appearing here in verse 3, that will occur again, ahima, is also translated by others as turmoil. I preferred here the more physical sense of moaning versus the inner quality of turmoil, but both are simultaneously embedded in the word ahima. Now for the change at the last of the title, and that's verse 7. To build to verse 7, verses 5 and 6. My heart writhes. Richard Levy translates it as, my heart beats within me, and terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. And we feel the sense of physical and emotional turmoil. And now verse 7, and I say, who will give me a wing like a dove? And my note is that the wing is in the singular, is aver rather than wings, more commonly translated as wings. But already the early rabbis, the same rabbis who write the Mishnah, who write midrash, homiletical descriptions, will say that the singular here in verse 7 of the singular wing is distinctive to the dove. They will say in Bereshit Rabbah 9, paragraph 8, that a dove is distinctive in its ability to keep flying, and it does so even when tired by tucking in one wing so as to rest it, and then will switch wings. I did not research if that is true, but what is true is that the image here of the psalmist who knew the story of Noah is that the dove is a bird that flies long and far. In the image of the dove in Noah's Ark, Noah first sends out a raven, which doesn't come back, but then sends out a dove. And the dove comes back to the ark with an olive branch in its beak. That's the symbol of peace. The dove becomes the image at which was able to suggest an opportunity to leave the sequestration of the ark. And we have the feeling here of the psalmist surrounded by enemies who circle the city, and he's feeling threatened. And there's another piece to that story in the book of Noah. The dove that returns with the olive will then be sent out a second time. And when the dove does not return, that's when Noah knows it's time to leave the ark. Back to the image of the olive branch, the olive tree, as we've seen earlier in our Psalm study, is a tree identified with deep roots and overcome great harshness of the elements. And the dove as symbol here of peace, as what he longs for as it continues. I would fly away and be at rest. Behold, I would wander far off. I would nudge in the wilderness. I would make haste to a shelter for me from the stormy tempest wind. Now, there are certain expressions like when an airplane, Arnold Sugarman pointed this out in our discussion this morning, has an engine go out, they say it flies on a wing and a prayer. One wing, back to the image here. And verse 7 and 9 can be read as a prayer. Who will give me a wing like a dove? I would fly away and be at rest. Behold, I would wander far off. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would make haste to a shelter for me from the stormy tempest wind. It can also be viewed as a daydream, a longing expressed of emerging safely, like a bird being able to fly away. A pause to acknowledge that there are certain expressions like a tempest that will inform perhaps Shakespeare's use of that word. In Hebrew, so'ah misa'ar is again a certain kind of assonance, a certain kind of sound that emphasizes stormy seas of wind. I also free associate to Jim Morrison and his song Shelter from the Storm. Until we're born into this world we're thrown of the doors, which is to say that many of the images of Psalms that we're drawing and focusing in on are the images that will later become important words in literature or in music. That's in part because of the power of Bible, particularly Psalms, to be a well from which literary motifs are drawn. It's also because these motifs are archetypes that the psalm draws from, meaning there are larger human natural experience of life, storms, of tempests, of feeling as if one has but one wing with which to fly. At the end of the psalm, there is a sense of hope, but a return first to the pain. Smoother than butter was his, verse 22. But battle was in his heart, the singular. Again, this friend who betrayed the psalmist. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Martin Cohen, my teacher and who wrote his commentary on the book of Psalms, says this psalm can be understood as the experience of someone who is in a divorce, betrayed, all the more in the context of a divorce due to infidelity. The sense that your whole world of what you relied on, what you saw as your foundation, is somehow shattered by betrayal. That's clearly the story here of David with Achitophel. Someone asked in our discussion, why did Achitophel turn on David? The text does not say, but Achitophel, in the case of the Bible, chose to go the young upstart, the stronger, physical, confident leader, Absalom, rather than stay with the now aged, ailing David. We don't know why, but this is a psalm of pain, of betrayal. And in the story, not only does Achitophel die at his hands, but likewise his son Absalom will die in that pursuit of David, being on his horse by a tree and as if he's hung by the tree, and David's soldiers will then kill him. And so David will be vindicated, and in this psalm, the psalmist survives. But for you, God, verse 24, cause them to descend to the pit of Shachat. And the last line, but as for me, I will trust in you. And again, this verse 24, va'ata, and as for you, God, va'ani, and as for me, the relationship endures. Eftach bach, I will trust in you. A key motif throughout the Psalms is the trust that one places in God sustains one through the turbulence, challenge. In my own life, I have not fortunately felt that quality of betrayal that is described by the psalmist, this extreme, and literally where his life was threatened. But for all of us, there are the experiences of our foundation can be shaken, can be challenged. Our sense of what is right in the world can be challenged by people that we live with, that we seek to have relationship with. And that quality of turbulence is reflected in this psalm and is perhaps recited in such moments of turbulence with the image of, may I be like a dove with that wing that allows perspective to rise above a situation. That's the emphasis of Rabbi Richard Levy in terms of that image, that when we are in moments of turmoil, may we be given the perspective from above to see our world and to have a bigger picture that allows us to know of a longer trajectory that enables hope and trust. And so in turbulent times, may Psalm 55 be a resource for us in finding calm, in finding hope, in gaining perspective. Thank you. Tomorrow, Psalm 56, a psalm that focuses on a bottle of tears. Thank you.